Chapter 5. Stefan Arkadovich had learned easily at school, thanks to his excellent abilities, but he had been idle and mischievous, and therefore was one of the lowest in his class. But in spite of his habitually dissipated mode of life, his interior grade in the service, and his comparative youth, he occupied the honorable and lucrative position of president of one of the government boards at Moscow. This post he had received through his sister Anna's husband, Alexei Alexandrovich Karenin, who held one of the most important positions in the ministry, to whose department the Moscow office belonged. But if Karenin had not got his brother-in-law his berth, then through 100 other personages, brothers, sisters, cousins, uncles, and aunts, Stiva Oblonsky would have received this post, or some other similar one, together with the salary of 6,000, absolutely needful for him, as his affairs, in spite of his wife's considerable property, were in an embarrassed condition. Half Moscow and Petersburg were friends and relations of Stefan Arkadovich. He was born in the midst of those who had been and are the powerful ones of this world. 1/3 of the men in government, the older men, had been friends of his father's, and had known him in petticoats. Another third were his intimate chums, and the remainder were friendly acquaintances. Consequently, the distributions of earthly blessings in the shape of places, rents, shapes, and such, were all his friends, and could not overlook one of their own set. And Oblonsky had no need to make any special exertion to get a lucrative post. He had not only to refuse things, but to show jealousy, not to be quarrelsome or take offense, all of which from his characteristic good nature he never did. It would have struck him as absurd if he had been told that he would not get a position with the salary he required, especially as he expected nothing out of the way. He only wanted what the men of his own age and standing did get, and he was no worse qualified for performing duties of the kind than any other man. Stepan Arkadovich was not merely liked by all who knew him for his good humor, but for his bright disposition and his unquestionable honesty. In him, in his handsome, radiant figure, his sparkling eyes, black hair and eyebrows, and the white and red of his face, there was something which produced a physical effect of kindliness and good humor on the people who met him. "Aha, Stiva Oblonsky, here he is," was almost always said with a smile of delight on meeting him, even though it happened at times that after a conversation with him it seemed that nothing particularly delightful had happened. The next day and the next, everyone was just as delighted at meeting him again. After filling for 3 years the post of president of one of the government boards at Moscow, Stepan Arkadovich had won the respect as well as the liking of his fellow officials, subordinates and superiors, and all who had had business with him. The principal qualities in Stepan Arkadovich which had gained him this universal respect in the service considered, in the first place, of his extreme indulgence for others, founded on a consciousness of his own shortcomings; secondly, of his perfect liberalism, not the liberalism he read of in the papers, but the liberalism that was in his blood, in virtue of which he treated all men perfectly equally and exactly the same, whatever their fortune or calling might be; and thirdly, the most important point, his complete indifference to the business in which he was engaged, in consequence of which he was never carried away and never made mistakes. On reaching the offices of the board, Stepan Arkadovich, escorted by a deferential porter with a portfolio, went into his little private room, put on his uniform, and went into the boardroom. The clerks and copyists all arose, greeting him with a good-humored deference. Stepan Arkadovich moved quickly as ever to his place, shook hands with his colleagues, and sat down. He made a joke or two, and talked just as much as was consistent with due decorum, and began work. No one knew better than Stepan Arkadovich how to hit on the exact line between freedom, simplicity, and official stiffness necessary for the agreeable conduct of business. A secretary, with the good-humored deference common to everyone in Stepan Arkadovich's office, came up with papers and began to speak in the familiar and easy tone which had been introduced by Stepan Arkadovich. "We have succeeded in getting the information from the government department of Penza. Here, would you care?" "You've got them at last," said Stepan Arkadovich, laying his finger on the paper. "Now, gentlemen." And the sitting of the board began. If they knew, he thought, bending his head with a significant air as he listened to the report, what a guilty little boy their president was half an hour ago. and his eyes were laughing during the reading of the report. Till 2 o'clock the sitting would go on without a break, and at 2 o'clock there would be an interval in luncheon. It was not 2 yet, when the large glass doors of the boardroom suddenly opened and someone came in. All the officials sitting on the further side under the portrait of the Tsar and the eagle, delighted at any distraction, looked around at the door, but the doorkeeper standing at the door at once drove out the intruder and closed the glass door after him. When the case had been read through, Stepan Arkadyevitch got up and stretched, and by way of tribute to the liberalism of the times, took out a cigarette in the boardroom and went into his private room. 2 of the members of the board, the old veteran in the service, Nikitin, and the Kammerjenkin, Grinovich, went in with him. "We shall have time to finish after lunch," said Stepan Arkadyevitch. "To be sure we shall," said Nikitin. "A very sharp fellow this Fomin must be," said Grinovich of one of the persons taking part in the case they were examining. Stepan Arkadyevitch frowned at Grinovich's words, giving him thereby to understand that it was improper to pass judgment permanently, and made him no reply. "Who was that came in?" he asked the doorkeeper. "Someone, your Excellency, crept in without permission directly my back was. He was asking for you. I told him when the members come out, then. Where is he?" "Maybe he's gone into the passage, but here he comes anyway. That is he," said the doorkeeper, pointing to a strongly built, broad-shouldered man with a curly beard who, without taking off his sheepskin cap, was running lightly and rapidly up the worn steps of the stone staircase. One of the members going down, a lean official with a portfolio, stood out of his way and looked disapprovingly at the legs of the stranger, then glanced inquiringly at Oblinsky. Stepan Arkadyevitch was standing at the top of the stairs. His good-naturedly beaming face above the embroidered collar of his uniform beamed more than ever when he recognized the man coming up. "Why, it's actually you, Levin, at last," he said with a friendly, mocking smile, scanning Levin as he approached. "How is it you have deigned to look me up in this den?" said Stepan Arkadyevitch, and not content with shaking hands, he kissed his friend. "Have you been here long?" "I have just come and very much wanted to see you," said Levin, looking shyly and at the same time angrily and uneasily around. "Well, let's go into my room," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, who knew his friend's sensitive and irritable shyness, and taking his arm he drew him along, as though guiding him through dangers. Stepan Arkadyevitch was on familiar terms with almost all his acquaintances, and called almost all of them by their Christian names. Old men of 60, boys of 20, actors, ministers, merchant, and adjutant generals, so that many of his intimate chums were to be found at the extreme ends of the social ladder, and would have been very much surprised to learn that they had, through the medium of Oblonsky, something in common. He was the familiar friend of every one with whom he took a glass of champagne, and he took a glass of champagne with every one. And when in consequence he met any of disreputable chums, as he used in joke to call many of his friends, in the presence of his subordinates,